very, very pleased to be able to introduce Mathur to you. I have been looking forward to hearing her speak in person for quite some time, and I'm glad that she's doing so here because I have a front row seat. So I'm really excited to hear her talk. So come on in. Don't worry, she's going to talk about food. So bring your food on in. But let's go ahead and get started. So I'm Kristen Stilt of Harvard Law School, the Brooks McCormick Jr. Animal Law and Policy Program. And I'm very delighted to introduce Maya Mathur for our afternoon conversation. As you can see on the screen, Maya's talk is Nudges to Reduce Meat and Animal Product Consumption, the State of the Scientific Evidence. And as you'll soon see, Maya has these incredible research skills that we could all very much benefit from learning from her. She's an assistant professor at Stanford University in the Quantitative Sciences Unit at Stanford Medical School. She's also the principal investigator of the Humane and Sustainable Food Lab and the associate director of the Stanford Center for Open and Reproducible Science. So she is a real scientist. And her lab research on animal welfare focuses on educational and choice architectural needs to reduce consumption of meat and animal products. Maya is already a star, even as an assistant professor. She's received early career and young investigative awards from the Society for Epidemiologic Research, the Society for Research Synthesis Methods, and the American Statistical Association. So we're so pleased that you're here, Maya, to share with us what you have learned from your research.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristen, for the introduction. And it's really a pleasure and an honor to be here, so thank you. So as Kristen said, I'm going to be talking about nudges to reduce meat and animal product consumption. And just to give a little bit of background on why I'm here, so indeed my background is actually mainly in developing new statistical methods. I focus especially on meta-analysis and causal inference, but I have also been very interested in research around animal welfare, especially reducing factory farming. So I had started dabbling in this as a postdoc back in 2019. I led a meta-analysis, and it was kind of a fun side project, and I got completely sucked in by how interesting the issues were and how interesting and cool the collaborators were who I met. So then, just recently this year, I more officially launched this research direction as a lab at Stanford called the Stanford Humane and Sustainable Food Lab, which was also really thanks to a tremendous amount of student interest in these issues, which I hadn't necessarily anticipated, but students were really excited to actually engage in this type of research. And so our goals are kind of twofold. So first, to try to use academic research to accelerate society's transition to an animal-free food system. But secondly, also to try to help build a new academic field around these types of empirical research questions. I think right now the incentives are not necessarily there for early career academics like myself to try to engage in this type of research. So I'd like to try to change that going forward. So why should we reduce meat and animal product consumption? Well, this won't be news to anyone here, but there's a myriad of different reasons, right? So one is to improve individual health. We've got strong evidence regarding many types of chronic diseases that excessive meat and animal product consumption is bad. To reduce risks of zoonotic pandemics. To reduce the risks of antibiotic resistance. To slow climate change, and last but certainly not least, to avoid the intense suffering of billions of animals yearly on factory farms. So what are some ways that we might go about reducing consumption? Well, a couple of categories, not exhaustively, are, well, first, we could try to enact some kind of legal regulation. This could be animal welfare standards or environmental standards. Or we could try to educate the public on reasons to reduce consumption and hope that people will do that voluntarily. A third category, and the one I'll focus on today, is what's called choice architecture. And this is basically making small changes to the environments where foods are chosen or eaten that will help kind of nudge people towards choosing plant-based options. So the reason it's called choice architecture specifically is it's really about the context where foods are chosen. So this image here is actually a study we did at the Stanford dining halls. And what's going on here is that this poster, which talks about the climate impacts of meat and animal product consumption, is being placed strategically right above the meat dishes. So the idea is it's kind of a hybrid between education, so telling people about climate consequences, and also choice architecture, because it's placing this message right above the meat dish, so you see it right as you're making that choice. It's very convenient. So I'm going to focus today on this last category of choice architecture, because I think it's a very promising and interesting means to reduce consumption. And so these categories also are not mutually exclusive, and I think often the places where they interact can actually give us especially interesting means to intervene. So for instance, legal challenges to ag-gag laws can serve, of course, not only as a legal challenge, but also as education to the public if these things make it out into the media. Additionally, for example, at the nexus of law and choice architecture, we have seen in some contexts mandatory choice architecture being implemented in public institutions. And I'll talk about a really interesting example of that later on. And then, perhaps sitting at the nexus of all three are things like mandatory nutrition labels on products. So it educates the user, it's federally required or state required, and additionally, it's choice architecture because it's right there when you're picking up the food in the grocery store. Okay, so my lab is young, and so we're kind of trying to look initially at a broad set of interventions. So just to name a few, so one project that my PhD student is leading is looking at the effects of education in the form of nationally prominent documentaries, like The Game Changers, on measures of national meat consumption in the US. So do these kinds of really salient forms of education actually move the needle in terms of people's actual consumption? And then on the choice architecture front, we have two kind of main directions that we're focusing on right now. So one is looking at a whole bunch of restaurants that rolled out a new plant-based meat or similar plant-based product in their menu. So maybe they added an Impossible Burger, or maybe they added a Just Egg breakfast sandwich or something like that. And looking at the effect of that new plant-based meat or analog on changes in animal meat consumption. This is trying to look at the question of whether these plant-based foods are actually shifting people away from meat as opposed to maybe just adding more options for those who are already vegan or vegetarian. The one I'm going to focus on today is actually a intervention that we did in the university dining halls. And so what we did was actually just manipulating the portion size of meats and animal products to see if that could reduce consumption. Okay, so just to frame this conversation, what is it that we actually want in an intervention? Well, we want things that are effective, obviously, but we also want things that can be done cost effectively in the real world. So we want them to be relatively cheap, we want them to be easy to implement, and we want them to be relatively widely applicable across settings. This gets to some extent to the replicability that Georgia talked about earlier. This seems like, okay, of course we want these four things. Like, what else would we want? In practice, I think the academic literature has not always prioritized these considerations. Sometimes we tend to focus on things that are kind of interesting experiments we can do in the lab, or maybe very intensive interventions, texting people every day, sending them constant reminders. And these things can be effective, but are they easy enough to actually scale up in the real world quickly and easily? So I want to focus on interventions that I see as being relatively well evidenced that also seem to do a good job preliminarily of meeting these criteria. Okay, so the first of these is to just offer more vegetarian or ideally vegan options in a food service setting. So there was an interesting study recently in PNAS where they did a relatively simple intervention. And they did this in university cafeterias. They essentially just approximately doubled the percentage of meal offerings that were vegetarian from a baseline of about 25%, which is already relatively good, speaking on average, to more like 50%. Now, at the outset, we might think, like, is this actually going to work, right? It could be that people walk into the cafeteria already knowing if they want a vegetarian meal or not. And so if someone is an omnivore, then perhaps they'll choose the meat-containing option, whether there's one option or 10 options, right? And likewise for vegetarians, maybe they'll just choose the veg option, regardless of how many choices there are. And so an intervention like this, a priori, might or might not work. In fact, this actually did work. So this doubling of the percentage of vegetarian meals was associated with an increased rate of vegetarian meal sales of about 8 percentage points. So it's not a doubling of vegetarian meal sales, but it is an increase. So it indicates that there are, at least a decent proportion of omnivores who will switch just because there are more options available. So maybe they weren't interested in the quinoa salad, but they are interested in the, the Impossible Burger, for instance. And this type of intervention is something that could be done in many food service contexts. So on the right here is a menu of a chain where this is a great example where somewhat hyperbolically they say there's over 16,000 possible combinations of vegan pizzas you can make. So that's as many options as you can possibly want. So I like this because this is an intervention that's actually applicable to many settings. Now, another important thing about this study was it looked at what are called rebound effects. So here's something that could go wrong. Let's say the cafeteria changes the proportion of vegetarian meals at lunch. People eat more vegetarian meals. And then dinner rolls around and they say, I haven't had meat yet today, so let me make sure to add more meat at dinner. That's possible. Maybe people have a quota of how much meat they want to eat. So it's important to look at these kinds of rebound or backfiring effects, as well as the kind of main estimate of what happened at the lunch meals. So in the study, they actually only did this intervention at lunch, and they found happily that there were not rebound effects at dinner. So it was not the case that people ate more meat to compensate once dinner rolled around. Okay, here's another one. So this is a creative partnership between researchers and a zoo cafeteria. So this zoo cafeteria has both animal burgers and it has plant-based burgers as well. And the intervention that they did was to place different types of promotional signs and posters that basically promote this vegan burger. And the clever way that they did this was by referring in some way to animal welfare in these signs and posters. There were a couple of variations, but for instance, this top one just says, do you consider animal welfare to be important? So it's kind of clever, right? It's provoking this cognitive dissonance where it's like you're in a zoo, you just saw animals, do you consider animal welfare to be important? And then there's this burger right here. So it's hitting you over the head with it. And so these posters were, again, choice architecture because they were physically placed right in your line of sight as you're in line, and then also right by the register. And so they did this over different days for 29 days of data collection. And this actually did help. It didn't help enormously, but it did increase the percentages among the burgers sold, veggie, from 4.7% without posters to about 6.5 to 9.9% with posters. So again, not a huge difference, but it is a difference, and it's certainly an easy intervention to implement, which is a plus. Okay, another category that I'm very excited about are default meal choices. This can also be called opt-in versus opt-out. These types of interventions have a very strong history in other areas. So they're used with organ donation in the US for your driver's license. So in the US, when you go to get your driver's license, the default is that you will be an organ donor if you get killed in a car accident. You can opt out, but the default is opt-in. And this has been shown in studies to be very, very helpful at helping people to opt into this pro-social behavior. So the idea here is simply in contexts where we can make plant-based meals the default, why don't we do that? And people can opt out, preserving choice, but the default is plant-based. So this was an interesting study done in Denmark, which was looking at conferences with buffets. So much like this one, except unlike this one, these conferences offered both plant-based and meat options. And so the way this was structured was you go to RSVP for the conference, and you get one of two stories. Story number one is we're going to serve a non-vegetarian buffet. If you would like a separate box meal to be made for you that is vegetarian, then indicate and you can get it. So this is default meat. The other version is at this conference, a vegetarian buffet will be served. If you want to opt out and get a boxed meal that contains meat, you can do so. And this was hugely effective. So this actually increased the percentage of plant-based meals from 6% when the buffet is meat to 87% when the buffet is vegetarian. Very, very striking. Now, one thing that's important to note about this is that I think the context here is kind of important. So part of the reason this works, defaults work in general, is just it's easier, right? It's the path of least resistance to go along with the default options. There's another important reason as well, which is social norms. So when people, and we saw this, right, animals have social norms, we have social norms too. And so if we get the second message here, it kind of sends the message like this is sort of a vegetarian community and you can opt out and get a meat meal, but then you're also kind of opting out of the social context of this conference. And so one thing that's important about the way this study is framed is that there's something very awkward about like being the one who's getting a box made for them separately when the default is a buffet. So what would happen in a different context where everyone is getting a box meal, but we're still implementing defaults? So this was a study I was involved in that was a partnership between Harvard and UCLA, where we basically looked at, again, online RSVP forms for different college events. And again, the default was either plant-based or meat, but unlike the conference study, in this case, everyone was getting a boxed meal, and the option was just, do you want to opt out of whatever is the default? And here again, the intervention was very, very effective. So having the plant-based default increased the percentage of plant-based choices from 18% when the default was meat to 66% when the default was plant-based. Not as effective as the buffet setting, but still quite effective. And this is also a very common food service context, boxed meals, right? So this could be done in many settings. Okay, so that's just 4 categories. There's many others, but let's kind of step back and look at the 4 considerations we talked about earlier. So we said we wanted interventions that are effective. So do these meet that criterion? Well, I think I would cautiously say probably. At least in these relatively initial studies and their specific settings. As Georgia alluded earlier, we really need replication, and we need especially pre-registered replications, meaning studies for which the protocol has been decided in advance and time-stamped as such to really ensure that these are not mere artifacts of publication bias. But cautiously, they do seem effective in these initial studies. Are they cheap? Unfortunately, we don't really have cost-effectiveness estimates yet. So many of these do seem pretty cheap, like posters or defaults. Defaults might even save money if you're shifting people to more inexpensive meal options, but we don't really know. Are they easy to implement? These ones, I think probably yes, but it certainly is going to depend on the context. And are they applicable across many settings? This is, again, where we really need replication. And some of these, like the thing about the zoo, the posters in a zoo, that's a very specific context where you were just seeing animals and now you're making a decision about whether to eat them. So, is that going to work somewhere else? Not clear. More subtly, I think, some studies that are in specific populations, like college students, as we studied in our default study, may or may not translate as well to other audiences. So we really need to assess this going forward. Okay, another really important caveat is that with nudges writ large, so not necessarily food, but all different types of nudges, there is evidence that much of the literature is severely compromised by publication bias. Namely, people submitting, reporting, and journals publishing results that favor the nudges rather than show that they don't work. So this was a reanalysis of a very high-profile meta-analysis that looked at all different types of nudges, including food. The meta-analysis concluded nudges are pretty effective. The reanalysis concluded not much evidence for nudging, again, after adjusting for publication bias. Now, I would caveat that it depends on the study. So there's actually a lot of statistical uncertainty associated with these estimates. So it doesn't mean no evidence for nudging. It does mean caution is very much warranted when just skimming through the published literature. Okay, but some good news is we do have some preliminary evidence that, that certain types of nudges are not only possible, but actually can work at relatively large scale in the real world. So very exciting thing that happened at the end of 2022 is that New York City, spearheaded by Mayor Eric Adams, decided to actually implement plant-based default meals in all of their public hospitals. Wow, this is a lot of meals. This is over 3 million lunches and dinners yearly. And they did this in a really interesting way. So the way it worked was for inpatients, if you're ordering the equivalent to room service, they say, okay, would you like this meal? And the meal would be always something plant-based as the first option. Would you like the, lasagna primavera? It's plant-based. That's all they ask you. If you say no, then they say, would you like the vegetable minestrone, which is also plant-based? If you say no, then they say, would you like the ribeye steak? So you have to go through this cascade of options, and you're not even told at the beginning that the ending of this decision tree is going to be the ribeye steak. So very interesting model, very creative. And it seemed to have worked. So with the plant-based default, 60% of patrons are choosing one of the two plant-based options. Now, unfortunately, we don't have pre-intervention data. It wasn't an experimental study, but 60% seems like a lot. It seems like this was effective. And importantly also, patron satisfaction was very high. It was like over 90%, which is kind of remarkable given that it's hospital food. Plant-based or not plant-based, it's pretty high satisfaction. So very, very impressive and quite interesting. And I think more recently they actually found concrete reductions in carbon emissions due to this protocol. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about some research that my lab is doing at Stanford around choice architecture, and in particular, what we call the SCOOP study. So spoon capacity outcomes on protein serving size and satisfaction. I wish I had come up with it. It was actually one of our wonderful dining hall partners came up with this acronym. And this was led by my PhD student, Anais Voski. So we are super grateful to be able to partner with the dining hall team at Stanford, and they have actually been doing choice architecture for many years, long before we started working with them. So they actually have many of their dining halls set up, for instance, so that the healthier options are kind of earlier in the lineup. Maybe you have to go through a kind of sequential, like IKEA, to go through the food, and like what they see as the less healthy options are towards the end. So they've actually been doing a lot of this for a while. What's new with our partnership with them is the focus on plant-based options in particular as something that we want to encourage. Okay, so we did a study where we wanted to try an intervention that we hoped was, again, cheap, effective, scalable, and we also wanted something that would work in certain food service contexts where things like defaults might not work. Okay, so what do I mean? Well, imagine you're at a cafeteria or a Chipotle or a build-your-own-bowl type of place. And so you're going through this lineup of options to build your burrito or your entree, and the server is asking you, okay, do you want this? Do you want guacamole? Do you want beef? Do you want beans? And you're saying yes or no to each one. And they're scooping it out for you. This is a context where it's a little bit harder to implement defaults. You can certainly add more vegetarian options, but not all of the types of choice architecture I mentioned earlier will work in this type of setting. So we were wondering, well, there's actually a pretty big literature on portion size nudges in the context of like attempted weight loss or something like that. What if we just used it to try to reduce the portion size of meat? And then people have all these other food options in this lineup so they can just choose more of something else. So conveniently, there's one Stanford dining hall that has a very popular burrito bar. It's called Cardinal Sage. So it's a lot like Chipotle, except better. And so it works in exactly that way, where you go through the lineup, and once you're offered meat, you could decline and get something else. So we did a very subtle intervention where we took the spoon they were already using, which is on the right. This is 4 ounces, 4-ounce capacity of meat. And we changed it to only 3 ounces, so a 25% reduction. We only did this for the spoon that was used to serve meat and not the spoons that were used to serve all the veggie options. Now, when you go through this lineup, there's flexibility. If you say, I want a second scoop, they'll give you a second scoop. So it's not like you can only get what you're given, but by default, you're going to get this one level scoop of whichever spoon is in use. And the way we collected data on this was to do a controlled experiment of alternating intervention weeks, so that's the 3-ounce spoon, and control weeks, so that's the original 4-ounce spoon. We did this only during lunch. And we collected 38 days of data in the main study. So what we mainly wanted to look at was outcomes related to total meat consumption at the burrito bar, as well as per patron meat consumption, using indices of how many students, patrons, but mostly students, were coming into this dining hall at lunch. We also wanted to look at measures of patron satisfaction. So this is something that hasn't really been looked at in many of the previous studies. But in our discussions with the dining hall staff, it became clear that this is really critical for these interventions to actually get used in practice. It's kind of intuitive, right? But the dining halls are not gonna, they could just remove all meat from the menu, right? Like they can do that, but the students would be frustrated. So when we're working with food service, if we want interventions they will actually implement, it needs to also keep patrons happy. So we did surveys to look at how hungry, how full, how satisfied were people after their meal. We also collected the same measures of consumption at dinner, again, to look at rebound effects. So there was no intervention at dinner, there was no burrito bar, but we wanted to see whether people would change their meat consumption at dinner to compensate. Okay, so results were promising. So it looked like the intervention did reduce total meat consumption by about 24 pounds per day. So that's 11 kilograms. If anyone's mental math is better than me, you can convert it, but I think it's about 11 kilograms, which is about an 18% reduction from the status quo at this particular dining hall. However, it's important to note that there was a lot of kind of noise associated with this estimate. Why? Because there was just a lot of variation in how much overall traffic and how much consumption there was at this dining hall. So it was important to do another study and get a more precise estimate to confirm. There were also other reasons we wanted to do a second study. So one was a burrito bar is a very specific thing. And we wanted to look at other types of menu items as well and other types of animal protein. So the burrito bar was pretty much always pork or beef. What about chicken? What about fish? And what about totally other entrees? What about curries? What about sandwiches? Would it work in those contexts? So we moved to a different Stanford dining hall, and our wonderful chef team actually made us our very own station, beautiful entree station called Fireside at this dining hall. And it was specifically for our study. So what was really cool about it was we needed all of the animal proteins to be scoopable. So we can't study this intervention with fish fillets or bone-in chicken or something like that. So we needed to have credible, like not weird menu options with, with scoopable meat where we could actually do this. And our team was amazing because they were also trying to think of what's like a delicious plant-based alternative we could have. I ate at this dining hall many times during the study, and I can attest it was wonderful. So this is an example of a creative one where it was a sort of a tuna sandwich. You can see the tuna is the last one over there, but then there's also these delicious veggie options that you can put in there instead. So the other change we made here was we said, well, a 25% reduction in spoon size worked well. What about a 50% reduction in spoon size? Like maybe they'll be just as happy. So we decided to halve the size of the spoons instead. All right, what happened? Null results. It did not work. So this time, the intervention had basically no effect on total meat consumption. It was only a 5.8 pound per day reduction across the whole dining hall, so maybe 2.5-ish kilograms, which was like basically nothing per patron. Okay, so it didn't work. How is that possible? We reduced portion sizes. We did hear that some people were coming back asking for seconds, so they would look at the spoon size and say, can I have another scoop of that tuna? That's one reason. Another reason, and this is very important, was a backfiring effect, where we had no idea this would happen. The intervention actually increased the percentage of patrons who ate meat. Why would that happen? Well, we don't really know, but it could be that some people are kind of maybe flexitarians. They want a little bit of meat as a condiment, but they don't want a whole lot. They go in this lineup, and if they see this huge scoop of pork, then they'll say, nah, I'll just go with the veggie fajitas instead. But if they see this tiny little condiment amount of pork, they'll go, okay, give me the pork. So maybe, we don't really know why, but maybe that's why. It's a very interesting effect. So that's one reason that total meat consumption didn't change. Also, unfortunately, now that the spoon is half as large, it also decreased satisfaction. And that's why we also think this backfiring effect number 1 is the key reason. Because number 2 suggests that people were more hungry and less full because they were getting less meat, but maybe more people were opting into the meat. So overall, across the whole dining hall, it didn't help at all. Again, we don't really know for sure, but that's our guess. Third possible backfiring effect is that the intervention may have slightly increased meat consumption at dinner. Now, this effect is, basically also very, very small, but it's about the same size as the effect of the intervention at lunch. So, but they basically wash out. But the point is, it may have actually slightly increased consumption at dinner. So bad news, or at least confusing news. So what are we going to do next? Well, we're going to publish our null results. Thank you, Georgia. But also, we are now starting to embark on the most comprehensive meta-analysis to date of all, not only choice architecture, but all interventions writ large whose intention is to reduce meat and animal product consumption. And we're hoping that that will help us narrow in on other promising candidate interventions to try. The other thing we're really excited about is we've expanded into collaborating with Stanford Catering, which does kind of boxed meals and buffets for conferences like this. And so that's another really exciting location where we can try to study interventions. So I mentioned only a couple forms of choice architecture, but there are many others. So I'll just point you to 2 review articles I think are pretty interesting that go through a number of different options as well. Okay, I want to now talk about a serious ethical caveat with not only choice architecture interventions, but a lot of the academic literature to date on reducing meat and animal product consumption. So many interventions to reduce meat and animal product consumption are designed with a couple of motivations in mind. At the outset, I laid out 5. So human health, zoonotic diseases, antibiotic resistance, climate change, and animal welfare. There's many others as well, but those are at least 5 that we should probably think about. However, a lot of interventions, especially coming out of the academic literature, have really focused almost exclusively on health and climate change. And so for that reason, they often focus exclusively on reducing red meat consumption. Now, if it were just a matter of reducing red meat consumption and then people don't eat anything else, that would be helpful for all of these things. But people need to eat a certain amount of food. So if you shift them away from red meat, what are they going to eat instead? Well, often they shift to eating white meat, chickens, fish, turkey, things like that. Arguably, interventions like this can actually really backfire ethically. Why? Well, it's for the simple reason that the animals that provide us with white meat are physically much smaller animals than the animals that provide us with red meat. And so while one cow produces many, many, many servings worth of burgers, a chicken or a fish produces only a much smaller number of servings equal size of meat. So if you shift someone from eating, X number of calories of beef to same number of calories of chicken, it's actually many, many more animals that are affected in the latter scenario. And so what this means is that when we shift people from consuming beef to chicken, eggs, and fish, it actually vastly, orders of magnitude, increases the number of animals raised on factory farms. And arguably, these types of species that we're shifting them onto have very, very bad conditions in factory farms, possibly even worse conditions than cows, although their conditions are also very bad, so it's sort of, all of it is bad, but some of it is even worse. Additionally, this also fails to address concerns of antibiotic resistance and prevention of zoonotic disease transmission. And so the point is, I think we want to design these interventions with a holistic view of the ethical impacts and not focusing only on reducing red meat consumption, which has been the majority of the academic literature to date. There's a really cool website, foodimpacts.org, that I think lays this out pretty nicely. So this looks at only animal welfare and climate change. And essentially what it lets you do is kind of toggle how much you want to prioritize each of those two considerations. And then on the right-hand side, it actually ranks how bad each type of meat or animal product is based on those, like that utility function that you provided. And so it's very interesting to play around with this because, for example, look at this one right here. So here I've weighted animal welfare and climate change equally, and yet still, the animals that are dominating this are shrimp, caged eggs, caged hens providing eggs, and salmon, which is a fish, right? Not red meat. And this is with a 50-50 weighting of climate change and animal welfare. If you start to weight animal welfare a little bit higher, it's completely dominated by smaller animals. Again, higher means it's a worse thing to consume based on this utility function. Oh, this is also cool because it lets you kind of, so how do you decide how to weight them and rank them? You can also do things like, okay, I want to weight the animals based on some proxies of maybe sentience, like brain size or neuron count or something like that, weight based on price elasticities of how much does consumption actually affect the amount of animals that are raised. So it's pretty interesting. I definitely recommend playing with it. Second reason for broadening our societal and ethical considerations is that a narrow focus on only climate change or only health, I think also risks not using certain additional effective means of persuasion. So this paper was actually kind of my first foray into research on animal welfare. It was a meta-analysis that specifically looked at interventions that appeal to animal welfare in some way. They might also have appealed to health, climate change, other things, but they at least appealed to animal welfare in some way. And the interesting thing about this was I don't think there had really never been an evidence synthesis on this. And there was actually very little academic literature. We found a lot of studies, actually 100 total, but 75% of them were actually coming out of evidence-based nonprofits and think tanks. So kudos to them. But in the academic literature, we're not really studying this type of intervention very much. And indeed, they actually seem to be relatively effective in this analysis. Now, an important caveat is many of these studies had methodological limitations, in particular, measuring outcomes based on self-report. How much meat did you eat last week? As opposed to hard outcomes like weighing the meat that was used in a cafeteria, which is what we did in our studies. So I don't treat this as definitive. I do think it's suggestive that this is a means of persuasion we should consider as well. And it's not something that we would think of if we're only looking at climate and health. Just to point you to a couple of other review articles as well. So these are ones that also talk about educational interventions. Because again, choice architecture is not the only thing. And I do think there's room for potentially interactions between education and choice architecture. So perhaps we educate people on reasons to reduce consumption, and then we also support them behaviorally by having reminders that are conspicuously placed near the settings where they're choosing food, or defaults or things like that. So supporting behaviors people might actually have been persuaded to engage in, but haven't quite gotten there yet on their own. So in summary, I think that choice architecture interventions are preliminarily promising means to reduce meat and animal product consumption. I certainly think it needs a lot more research. I think we need to better understand cost effectiveness, ease of use, applicability across settings. We need to figure out if this is all publication bias or if some of it is real. I do think some of it is real, but we need to sort the wheat from the chaff. And so for that reason, we need replications, especially those that are pre-registered. And then last, I ended with this call that, I really hope intervention designers and academics who are studying these things will start to broaden our ethical considerations, not only in order to capture new education opportunities, but also to avoid creating social changes that are maybe a net negative ethically. That would be an unfortunate, result of all these efforts. So that is it. The slide deck is posted publicly online if you want the references, and then the website for my lab is here as well. And as a new lab, we love feedback. So we're 6 months old, so we're always interested in feedback you have, leads to research we should be doing, and anything like that. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Maya. I know there's going to be a lot of questions, but I can't help but to start us off with, if you'll allow me to. And the first one is, so by way of background, we have been trying at Harvard to do some of this and have faced, in the college, faced great resistance. And one of the reasons has to do with the students knowing or not knowing that they're in some kind of study, right? So I was wondering, what are the ethical issues related to that? Did your participants, was there any awareness that they were a part of a study? Is there any human subject implications? Can you tell us a little bit about just how does one even get into doing a kind of study of this nature?
Yeah, that's a great question. So essentially what our IRB approved was not telling them they were in a study at the outset, but we did debrief them at the end. So they did know after they completed the survey, after the whole round of data collection was done, what we were doing. Now, it's a really important issue because I think one thing that's been a real methodological problem in this field is what's called social desirability bias. And this is where when people know they're being studied, they'll tend to act in a way that kind of supports what they know is being studied. There's a well-known thing called the Hawthorne effect in dieting studies in general, where this is in the context of individuals trying to lose weight. People will lose weight just putting them in a study and doing nothing, just because they're being monitored and they're in a study about weight loss. So the control group is always doing something. So I think one thing that's been really challenging in this literature, especially on education, is many studies will enroll participants, say, okay, now we're going to show you a graphic documentary about factory farming and biodiversity loss and artery plaques and all this stuff. 1 week later, remember us, we're the ones with the documentary about meat consumption. How much meat did you eat last week? Okay, so first of all, it's hard to remember how much meat you ate last week if you eat meat. And so there's always going to be some guesswork, and that guesswork, especially combined with saying, well, now I'm talking to these researchers who told me to reduce meat consumption. So then you might underestimate, especially, and this is critical, especially if you were in the arm that got the documentary. If you were in the other arm who got a control video, you just watched Sesame Street, and the researchers came back and said, how much meat did you eat? Then you're like, oh, I don't know if they want to eat more meat, less meat, whatever. So you could get a completely spurious effect only because of social desirability bias. So we do think it's really, really critical for participants not to know what we're doing, and it is tricky. So that is why, yeah, we pushed until we got the IRB to approve that type of model.
That's awesome. That's great. And then the second question, I suspect there's more than just me with it. I always find myself in this conversation, and many of you might have as well, which is that what is the best way to get to animal product consumption reduction, right? Is it to focus on individuals and the choices they make, or is it to focus on institutions and such that people are in a structure where there is less available or other ways in which plant-based options are more plentiful? And I feel like what you've shown us kind of gives us a suggestion that both are important, because Mayor Adams did a lot more than a scoop reduction, for example, it seems, if you're talking about overall impact. So where do your studies land us in terms of where should we be focusing for the advocates in the room, or for those of us who care about our own institutions trying to make changes? Where's the point, the pressure point that you think is most productive?
Yeah, great. So if I had to guess on a purely effectiveness front, I would say probably institutions and just kind of largely, mostly bypassing asking people to make voluntary changes. The whole history of, even people making dietary changes for their own health is not that great. We don't really have great interventions for people to make just, self-focused dietary changes. So it is really hard for people. That said, I think once we think about cost effectiveness and kind of feasibility, it does get a little bit harder because there's kind of this initial step of persuading the institution. And so, that has to be kind of factored into the resources and the costs associated with implementation. So, yeah, to my mind, the $1 million question is, given $1 million, how should I spend it to reduce factory farming? Is it education or is it some combination? So for that reason, I do suspect it's some combination. But I mean, the other thing too is that educating the public can help support choice architecture. For instance, like would the New York City thing have been perceived differently if people hadn't received at least some messaging about it? I mean, he mostly talks about climate change and health, but if people hadn't received that kind of messaging, would they be like, why are you doing this?
Has someone done a study of the whole sequence of events, the preparatory work, maybe seeding the message in New York so that there wasn't a backlash?
I don't think so, unfortunately. That would have been really fascinating. I do think we need more of these kind of mixed modal, kind of longitudinal studies of how does a social change like that come about? What are the kind of groundwork? And I think it's also relevant to law, for instance, too, right? So like what kind of public consciousness backdrop helps or hinders attempts to reform legislation, for instance?
But then there's the first question, which is how did the mayor himself come to believe that plant-based options were good not only for him but for who got to him? Was it he was sitting in a classroom? Was it a default veg flyer? Like what was his own personal journey? But then turning it into leadership. So
yeah,
there's layers of events had to take place before we get to this point.
Yeah,
hospitals.
Right. And there have been studies on kind of looking at current vegans and vegetarians who were not always vegan or vegetarian and asking them what caused them to change their behavior. And it is often education. It's often books, movies. For me, it was a chapter of The Omnivore's Dilemma, and that was kind of the first straw, and then the final straw was not much after that. But interestingly, I mean, so far, we're not necessarily seeing that giving people documentaries and things like that necessarily works. Now, maybe it's the case that among those who did change their behavior, that's the reason. But whether that form of education will work broadly is a little bit less clear.
So now I have to ask you, which chapter was it? Because had you not read that, you would not perhaps be here today doing these awesome studies, right? You would be studying maybe something else that has nothing to do with animal welfare. So which one was it?
Yeah, it was called The Glass Abattoir. So it's about slaughterhouses and all that goes on there. And I think that book is actually not particularly focused on plant-based, but I think having read that, I said I need to do more research on this, and then it was a rabbit hole. So, but I think one thing that actually caused me very directly to start doing research was a podcast, 80,000 Hours, and it was specifically an episode with Lewis Ballard about farm animal welfare. And that was absolutely fascinating review of the research. And he kind of ends with this call of like, we need more people doing academic research. I just had no idea that was even a bottleneck. So then I was like, all right, time to do a meta-analysis.
Yeah, your research is incredibly important, and so few people with your skills have the same dedication to the topic. So thank you. But your questions, and I think Amy is going to, Lauren's going to be our microphone runner. Okay. All right. So let's start. Let's start right in the middle, sir. Trying me to get you, Lauren. Sorry.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I think what you are doing with your research group is fantastic. And I was just thinking about one thing that if you already thought about vegan meals as default airplane meals, for example, because I think that would be, it will be cheaper for the airlines, maybe even safer, like for food safety issues, and I think that will be something we all would like to see happening.
I would love to see that. Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily have an end to the airplane industry, but I think about that whenever I fly, right? It's like if you want a vegan meal, it's like you have to just buy it at the airport or just eat pretzels for the entire flight. So yeah, no, I think that's exactly the kind of context where it ought to be a win-win-win for airplane company, animal welfare, and all the societal considerations, and the consumer, because they can get what they want as long as they're willing to opt out.
The New York Times article that you put up for New York said, "Don't say vegan though," right? Was that one part of the success? Is that it was labeled, these are plant-based options, and do you feel strongly about that?
I think this is fascinating. So I think we need more research on this, but there is evidence that the labeling and the nomenclature really matters. And so I think it does seem like plant-based kind of works better than vegan, in part because vegan is right now still an identity that's kind of not necessarily positive in many contexts. And so saying that a meal is vegan makes it sound like it's associated with an identity that some people may be actively avoiding. If the meal is plant-based, it doesn't necessarily sound quite as much like it's an identity. So yeah, and then the other interesting strand of research is around how to actually label like plant-based meats themselves, and also cultured meats coming down the road. So even the current term cultured meat is actually carefully workshopped. So lab meat is much worse. Like people do not want to eat lab meat. Calling it cultured meat, oh, that sounds like cultured cheese and like cultured mushrooms. Like I'm cultured, so I'm gonna eat that. And clean meat is also good. So there's a lot of interesting debates. And some folks are talking about calling animal meat legacy meat, which is kind of clever, right? So it's not like, oh, there's meat and then there's vegan meat. It's like, oh, there's legacy meat. That's, Internet Explorer type stuff. Now there's plant-based meat in Google Chrome.
Okay, I think you had in the front, right?
Thank you. This is so fascinating. I love the hospital and the school settings because it can be controlled, and also the choices can be dictated centrally from the cafeteria lead. I'm wondering, how do we replicate, like, in day-to-day life where customers, they can go to dozens of restaurants to choose from, and supermarkets have so many options. So do you have any recommendations around how it can be applied sort of to the mainstream options and culture?
Yeah, that's super important. So I think that's really an open research direction. There is one study that's quite interesting in PLOS Medicine where, to your point about supermarkets, now that's a hard context. You don't have someone serving you stuff. You don't have an obvious system of defaults. But this study looked at basically moving plant-based meats to a different location in the supermarket. So making them more conspicuous and salient, instead of having them in this like segregated little box that's like vegan meats like off in the corner, rather having them displayed. I think it was actually along with the animal meat, which some supermarkets are now doing, right? So it's like there's burgers made out of beef and then there's burgers made out of soy, like next to each other. And so the interesting thing about that was it increased sales of the plant-based meats, yay. It did not decrease sales of the animal meats. So that's really, and I think this type of thing is actually really critical, because I think there's a lot of assumptions often that, oh, these plant-based meats are gonna just move people away from meat. It's not necessarily the case. And what we're seeing so far with studies like that, and also certain studies about plant-based milk, which is now actually very widespread, is that they actually have not so far really moved people away from animal meat. So it could be so one option is, it's existing vegans and vegetarians say, now I have a new option. Great, let me try this. So that's not moving someone away from meat, it's moving someone away from tofu. Or it could be someone who was gonna eat meat anyway, buys the same amount of beef, and also they buy plant-based meat, and then they just eat more like meat and meat analog total. So I think it's really important, and we don't know.
All right, over here, please. Sorry, Lauren, I'm gonna make you run around.
Thank you so much. So many fascinating concepts that you've brought up, and actually it's really interesting to see a whole bunch of parallels in my own journey to becoming vegan about a decade ago, and even all the many things that happened up to that that you've mentioned, such as 80,000 hours and the concept of of chickens being much smaller, basically. My comment is about that, actually. I was just wondering whether or not you've considered, so just that foodimpacts.org website, And I understand that the main point of that was we need to look closely. There might be things that we haven't possibly considered that could crop up and adjust the overall outcomes of the choices that we make, the ways that we move people towards possibly choosing plant-based meals. But just one thing that jumped out at me was that was the concept of planetary health, and that when you reduce the environmental impact of food, such as by reducing beef consumption, you're also protecting wild animals to a huge extent. There's been approximately, I think it's about 96% depletion of biodiversity in Latin America, primarily fish populations, things like that. But there's been huge reductions, and a lot of that does have to do with land for cows. And so I just noticed that in your slide, and also possibly on foodimpacts.org, it talks about direct impacts on the animals that you specifically eat, but it seems to ignore wild animals, which are now, terrestrial and marine. Marine mammals, I think, are outweighed by terrestrial farm animals 10-1, something like that. So I guess it's kind of a comment. I just wanted to point that out and just get your reaction to that. And I also, to your comment about plain meals, I was wondering whether or not, clean meat or cultured meat carbon offsets might be sort of appropriate for plains, because people are already looking for that. So anyway, I just really want to thank you. I absolutely loved your talk. I'm definitely going to look into more of what you're doing, and thank you so much.
Yeah, so this is a really mind-bending question because, what you're saying is absolutely true. And so, it kind of comes down to, so in terms of the overall impact of, vastly increasing habitat for wild animals by reducing factory farming, the net impact of that is going to largely come down to, do you think that wild animals live a good life or not, right? So we're going to have more wild animals, and there's all these difficult kind of utilitarian philosophy questions around, is it better to have more animals in general than fewer animals? So I think it's honestly really challenging. I know there's some really interesting nonprofits now that are starting to really look quite hard at wild animal welfare and how to estimate it, how to figure out what the impacts are. I think we really don't know very well right now. So I think it's usually stated as an unalloyed good of having more habitat for wild animals, but then there is this possible concern of what if their lives are much worse than we thought. So it's challenging.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, River, please. So we'll go River and then Justin behind you.
Thank you. And thanks for the talk. Very fascinating. I was wondering if you could sort of comment on how enduring these nudges typically are with plant-based interventions, or just generally. I'm sort of thinking around the hospital example where, once they kind of get through that decision tree to the ribeye steak, does it lose its potency? Are these things that have to sort of continually be reinvented to keep up their efficacy, or is it more set it and forget it?
Yeah, I think you point to something that is a real limitation of many nudges, which is that, so the positive side is it doesn't require much thinking. You just show up at the hospital, you don't even know you're being nudged at. It's just, you just order the thing you want. Versus education potentially has this longer term impact. You read a chapter in a book, you remember the name of the chapter, 13 years later after I read it. So there is this issue that once someone is out of the nudging context, they're probably not going to continue that behavior. Now, not necessarily. It could be that it helps promote social norms, it helps establish habits, but by and large, nudges are designed to work in the context where they're happening. That said, I feel like we've done so little on the institutional nudging front that we have a lot of ways to go there. So I would like to see the education as well to kind of get at these longer term effects. I don't think nudges alone are going to produce long-term changes once people leave that context.
Thank you. So my question is related, and it's related to Kristen's, I think, second question. But so you made the point that legal or institutional reform is not mutually exclusive with this sort of choice architecture. I think that's absolutely right, and it's true. But then your example on your schematic was like a labeling law, which is a law sort of mandating choice architecture. But for people who are looking for different types of law reform, whether they're welfare or rights orientation, but a broader institutional reform, maybe like what Kristen was hinting at, do you think there is, this is a different version of Kristen's question, but do you think that there is a tension between nudges and this type of theory and institutional reform? Do you think that there is a, with the, I'm sure you've seen this article, the costly distractions article. What do you think of that type of literature that would suggest that at least as we educate the public about nudges and choice architecture, they're going to prefer that and think that it's adequate and not opt for legal reforms?
Yeah, no, this is fascinating. And I don't know. So yeah, costly distractions is an interesting paper. Do
you want to say something about that for people who haven't read it?
Yeah. So this is basically looking at, if I remember that one versus other similar papers correctly, I think that one's basically arguing that if you have people kind of change behavior in one context, then perhaps they will just compensate in some other context by doing something that offsets that. So an example is, I don't know if it was that paper or another, but in the environmental realm, it's something like, if you encourage people to reduce energy consumption by taking a shorter shower, then they'll drive more or something like that. I'm making up this example, but it's things of that form where you're compensating. So I think I'm aware of that being looked at on kind of the individual person level. I'm less aware of kind of on the societal level of, like support for legal reform. So yeah, I'm not sure, and it does concern me. Like what's the best balance between kind of immediate change and like support for longer term change? I was involved in a study led by some folks at Sentience Institute where we looked at kind of giving people newspaper articles about animal welfare reform. So this has been a really contentious thing. So reforms where, for example, you require hens to not be in cages or something like that. So it's better for them, but it's still a lot worse for them than just not being in a factory farm at all. And so a key question is, when people learn about these welfare reforms, do they just say, okay, well, now there's Prop 12, so we don't have to do anything. It's totally fine to just eat these eggs that are cage-free. Or do they say, oh, this is does it produce momentum? Do they say, oh, now this is a great small win, let's go for something else? Ideally, we want the latter, not the former. And so in that study, we found that it did not seem like telling people about animal welfare reforms makes them complacent in the sense of saying, okay, we're done. It also didn't necessarily create momentum. So that's at least one example where it was kind of somewhere in the middle.
So here's give this an example, I think, to what you're asking, Justin. So we haven't been able to do any of these kinds of studies at Harvard, as I mentioned. But if we could choose between, let's say, instituting plant-based Mondays, right, across the board, all dining halls, or some kind of nudging 7 days a week, putting the plant-based food up front with some educational information, letting the individual decide. So that's kind of an example of a law, right, from the dining service, which is there will be no animal products on Mondays versus a more educational nudge every day.
Yeah.
Would you have a preference for which one you think might be more effective or that you would pick?
Yeah, so I think patron satisfaction is going to really differ here, is my guess.
Okay.
So our dining halls actually had previously tried to do meatless Mondays, and the students absolutely hated it, which is really interesting because they didn't seem to hate the spoon size thing. Now, we didn't tell them it was happening, but I do think that, it's going to depend on the context and the audience, but I do think people react quite strongly against choice-limiting contexts like meatless Mondays, where it feels to them like it's saying you can't have meat versus, ultimately the effect might be the same on average, but somehow people might feel more okay if it's like, oh, you can easily opt out, but the default is this. Mm-hmm. One thing I think would be interesting is to kind of precede research like that with student surveys, saying what do you think about meatless Mondays? What do you think about, and try to figure out the type of choice architecture that people will be okay with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this insistence on the individual choice is so fascinating, and that's the kind of pushback we get as well. Well, the athletes, well, the people who have food allergies, well, the people who have body image issues. We can't tell anyone like what to eat or what not to eat. We have to leave it as a choice.
Yeah.
But at what point is the destruction of the planet something we're still going to allow, right,
Yeah.
people to choose?
I mean, and of course, there's plenty of precedent of other types of nudges, graphic warnings on cigarettes. I mean, there's all kinds of precedent. I do think food is this kind of deep identity thing that people feel, perhaps more like wounded. But I mean, so at our dining halls, it seemed to work fine. I mean, they're very mindful about, very real issues like food allergies and things like that. So they do actually have like a whole separate area, which is, entirely nut-free, entirely gluten-free. It's like away from all the other foods. So, people with those needs can very easily go there. And there's always both a meat option and a plant-based option as well. So they wouldn't be going probably to the burrito bar, but they do have this option still in the dining hall physically. So I think, our dining hall team is quite mindful of how to not put anyone in danger with things like food allergies, even when we do these nudges.
If Stanford students didn't like meatless Mondays, or plant-based Mondays, it doesn't really bode well for trying it in other. I would think that would be a really sympathetic group.
Yeah.
To get it.
I do as well, and that's why we kind of moved much more towards this like gentle nudge type thing. And I do like the idea of increasing veg options, putting them first. I mean, the dining halls have long been arranged physically so that the desserts are like actually hard to find. You have to go looking for your dessert, like hunting around for it. So I think, why can't the meat be there? Why can't the meat be off in this weird fridge?
Yeah, exactly, out the back door. So you've been waiting a while, and so have you. So can we jump over here, Lauren? Okay.
Yeah. Again, thank you for your presentation. Just an observation, in the U.S., in the last 10 years, maybe 15 years, I've noticed just as a consumer at the grocery store that companies originally had a lot of products that they marketed as vegetarian, and the vegan stuff would be off in the corner if they even had any. And then companies figured out, we can make vegan products that will appease the vegetarians and the vegans. So vegetarian or products marketed as vegetarian have almost disappeared. And there's more now options for vegan. But as you know, in the US, there's a lot of judgments that come along with the term vegan. And I don't know whether that has affected the consumption of these items. It's a bottom line decision on the part of the operations that are making these products. But again, the label vegetarian has pretty much disappeared. And maybe even in restaurants as well, because you're going to cover vegetarians by labeling things as vegan. Question to you, and I apologize if you covered this, but when you give people these different options, are you showing the nutritional information, protein, fat content, calories? Because I think that would surprise people, especially fat content in meat versus some of the vegetarian options.
Okay, so that's super interesting. So no, we don't show people nutritional information, and it's actually kind of intentional. So there was actually an earlier study at Stanford, this was before I was associated, where they were just trying to increase vegetable consumption. So not necessarily reduce meat, they just wanted to increase vegetables. So they tested out different types of labels on the vegetables in the dining hall. Now sometimes it focused on health. By the way, it was always the same dish. It was always, let's say, carrots. Okay, so on the one condition, it was healthy carrots, low sodium, low fat, which is true. On the other condition, it was carrots. On the third condition, it was lemon zesty carrot delight. Okay, same dish. Adding the label about delicious, zesty, whatever, the descriptive label, increased consumption. Adding the healthy label, decreased consumption compared to just calling them carrots. People would rather eat carrots than healthy carrots. So we have actually tried to not do that, because I do think there's probably a segment of the population who are really choosing for health reasons, but I think most people are choosing based on what's going to be tasty. And so to some extent, unfortunately, labeling it as healthy, even though it's true, makes it worse for some people. And I think your earlier point, too, about company incentives is really important as well, and highlights a niche that I hope we in kind of academia can fill, which is, the companies are making a very pro-social product, but they do have a bottom line, which is not entirely about shifting people away from meat. If they get consumers who are shifting away from meat, that's great. But also if they get consumers who are shifting away from the other brands vegetarian marketed product, that's also great for them. So for them, it's like they're competing with other plant-based companies as well as with meat. So I do think that's an important niche where it's like, yeah, as you said, maybe these labels are just basically like shifting people around among the plant-based consumers, which product they're going to buy. Whereas ideally what we want is shifting people from meat to the plant-based products, regardless of which one they choose. So I don't think it's a resolved question, but it's important.
Okay, great. Right here in the middle, Lauren?
Yes.
Oh, one second.
I can project.
It's for the recording.
Oh, okay. So first, thanks so much. It was really fascinating. I want to return to the goal of building a thriving academic field. And I want to ask you, who do you envision is included in that academic field? I imagine you're going to say everybody who wants to participate, but realistically, like given what you've been doing already, and let me say, I ask because I'm a historian of science, and recently have shifted my teaching and research to focusing on vegetarianism and veganism, both historically and in contemporary moment. And what I'm finding is that there are people in different fields, in law, for example, that are addressing really important issues, but they're not addressing, sort of plant-based food systems, let's say. I mean, so they're addressing the issue from the environmental impact or the legal impact or the animal welfare impact. So I'm really excited to see that you want to create a field, and who's currently participating in that, and how do you create a field that, I guess, ideally, in my mind, cuts across, the natural sciences, social sciences, and humanities. Is that actually happening?
Yeah, so this has been one of the most interesting surprises for me with this new lab, and it's been just so cool. I have my very niche skill set, which is around like math, causal inference, statistics, a little bit of social sciences. And I just thought I'll start this lab and PhD students will come, postdocs will come, whoever's interested. And I was really amazed at how diverse the interest actually was. So, I now have a PhD student in computer science, someone in environment, I have another one in education. And then there are other folks collaborating from the law school, from our new school for environmental studies. So it's actually been really cool to see how, and I think it's because it's such a relatively nascent academic field. It's like this lab is the one that is doing animal welfare focused food stuff at Stanford. And so it's meant that people come out of the woodwork from all different areas. And it's been amazing to see the kinds of insights that happen when you have this interdisciplinary team. It's been really fun, like having lab meetings with everyone. And we've got the legal policy research person, and we've got the education person, and we've got like a stats person. You just learn a lot that way. So I'm a big fan of interdisciplinary collaborations and trying to build them.
We're going to the teal greeny, but I have to ask, teal greenish jacket. But I have to ask a quick question. Maya, is the cost of admission, not cost of admission, is the test of admission essentially a willingness to want to check all 5 boxes? Is that essentially what holds everyone together? That you're not willing to jettison animal welfare in favor of planetary health, or it's all 5? Is that sort of what is cohesive about your group?
Yeah, I'd say it is. I am mainly focused on animal welfare myself, and so I think and I do think that's one of the most neglected of the considerations. So I think it's tended to draw folks who have at least some strong orientation towards animal welfare. But certainly a lot of people are very, very concerned about climate at Stanford and many universities, of course. So that's, I think, another one as well. But yeah, I also do really look for folks with the kind of skill set that will really support kind of rigorous research. And because I am relatively quantitative myself, I like folks who are going to be involved in that type of research.
Great.
Thank you. I wore teal on purpose so that I stand out. Couple of things, and I hope it actually comes into question, not just my comment. Thank you so much for all the great information, a lot of things to think about. I wanted to talk about as you mentioned, the social norm issue and social desirability in a way right now that, I've been a vegan for over a decade, and I'm a filmmaker, and just very recently I was trying to create a pitch for eco-horror with a vegan animal activist teenager, and I've been told by the pitch advisor to take out vegan animal, because and just leave activist. And because there is so much negative connotation, and they will right away turn off their interest. So I feel, I mean, not that I'm like coming up with something brilliant, but if we became, instead of a meat-eating society and more as a norm, a plant-based food-eating society, it would, like you mentioned, like that would be the default. And as Kristen mentioned, like, do we try to approach individuals or approaching the society with the fact what New York City mayor did? He's an individual, but because at the position that he's at, slowly starts creating the way of thinking where nobody dares to actually then even speak up, compared to a filmmaker trying to make a low budget movie that anybody can say is like, oh, don't say vegan. So is there a way that we can all start thinking about how to approach individually our people in government, and educating them maybe individually and suggesting different initiatives and incentives, and as they slowly start speaking about it, becomes more acceptable and less kind of a like, let's just not talk about it?
Yeah, I think this gets to the critical importance of social networks and how these things actually propagate. I actually just finished a book about this that I highly recommend. So it's called Change by Damon Centola. Last name is Centola. And he talks about kind of the critical importance of, for people to change their views on a behavior and change their mind, they need sort of redundant connections with multiple people who are saying the same thing and who are close to them socially. So it's not enough to kind of reach one kind of social superstar who changes their mind, because that person not only is hard to change their mind, but also they have these like radial connections with very disparate people, and they're not necessarily getting this like reinforcing network. And so he argues that more important is having like niches of perhaps less connected individuals start to change their mind. And so maybe this is very speculative on my part, but maybe this speaks to a strategy of kind of trying to reach, maybe more local representatives, people who are maybe associated with a state or a district or a province or something that is able to pressure them from different angles, and like maybe get that one to change, and then maybe it propagates. I think it's going to be very interesting to see whether the New York City model gets replicated elsewhere. That could be an interesting example of this, where it's like it starts in one place, and then maybe that can spread to other policymakers as well.
I think even the work that you're doing, and maybe this isn't the kind of type of article you normally write, but even something that kind of explains the kind of work at Stanford and the cooperation that you received. Sometimes these big Ivy California schools, it just takes one really prominent institution, and then other ones are more willing to do it. So yeah. I think so far it sounds like you're the only university that you know of in the U.S. that's doing these kind of studies.
No, so actually, so a really cool thing is some of our dining hall leadership, Sophie Egan and Eric Montel, actually sit on the founding committee of this thing called Menus for Change, which is a university research collaboration that is actually a whole network that do food studies, broadly speaking. Now, it's not largely focused on meat, but it is focused on research and dining halls. And so this is actually very much, so if the study had been successful, our next step would have been to roll it out at these partnering universities and see, again, replicability, larger sample sizes. But it's actually going to be a really great model for us to use going forward once we have something that works well at Stanford. Okay. Yeah, so the model is kind of try it first at one university. It's often been Stanford, and then kind of network out, to others.
That's great. That's great. All right, let's keep going. Maybe we'll go way to the back.
Hi, great talk. Thank you very much. Quick question. With regards to the study where you reduced the serving size, did you also look at the waste? Like, did you see a reduction in, food waste? And is that also something to look at and consider with reducing, the consumption of meat products?
I would love to do that in the future. I think that's really important, and is another important means to convincing institutions, right? It's like, look, it's saving you money, it's saving you food waste. So we didn't do that in this study, basically for logistical reasons. It would involve kind of weighing individual people's dishes as they're returned to the tray, and we need to know whether it's burrito bar versus something else. But actually, part of the reason we did this study at the burrito bar is we had been hearing that students were giving feedback to the dining hall that the burritos are too big. So we thought, well, they're not going to miss a little bit of meat if the burrito's already too big. They're already wasting, 25% of the burrito. So, I mean, that also could be another reason that results differed between the two studies. The burritos just, already had so much food waste associated with them that, maybe people ate the same amount of meat, and it was just that less ended up in the trash.
Right, yeah, I guess instead of even something simple, instead of weighing it, it's just asking when you're telling the person of the study at the end and just, did you eat your entire plate or not? Looking at something as simple as that.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I think someday in the future I'd like to do interventions that involve all the entrees in the whole dining hall, so that wouldn't work for this intervention, but for others it might, and then we could more easily just weigh food waste for absolutely everything that goes in the dish return.
Okay, great. Lauren, do you want to come down to the front here, and then we'll to the front, and then we'll bounce back up to you in the blue. Sure.
Hi, so thank you, Maya. That was just so interesting and so well and effectively presented. Super enjoyable. So my question is, let me start with so in one way we can look at this that like, oh, well, nothing was happening before. Now you're suddenly nudging people to eat vegetables, right? But we talked about this earlier, is that actually we've been living in an environment where we've been always constantly nudged the other way. Like, it's not as if there was some neutral ground and now suddenly you are manipulating everybody to change what they have naturally been eating. We've been living in an environment, and we all grew up where we were kind of nudged in this way. And I think like the addition of like milk products into all kinds of different foods, that's like it's almost like the secret nudging, right, to increase the sales of milk products. And so when you see it in that way, it's almost like you're like this little island nudging the other way in a sea of existing nudges to go the other way. And so my question is just, can you talk a little bit about, or if you're aware of, like, now that sort of these like animal welfare concerns are increasing, is there this counter movement? Is there another, like from the industry side, like animal production side, like are they thinking of ways to nudge back, like in this, to counter, the plant-based movement?
Yeah, they're fighting back as hard as they can. I mean, it's actually been pretty interesting. I think there's a story around Just Mayo that when this product launched, I think it produced this flurry of, I believe it was actually legal action against the Just companies, right? Basically because they felt threatened, because Just Mayo is delicious and it's a lot like mayo. So yeah, and then there's also been efforts to change the labeling requirements to try to basically increase the burdens on plant-based companies. They say things like, oh, the label that says plant-based, like people will be confused. It's false advertising. They'll think it's meat. It's like no one thinks it's meat. There's been research on this. It's pretty clear. But trying to make them increase the label size, which even if it doesn't turn customers away, it's just it's a costly burden on a small startup that needs to now like reproduce all its bags. And so just putting up these kinds of hurdles to try to make things harder. And then, yeah, some of them have been more substantive around, wanting the labels to say, not be able to name the animal product that it's replacing. So not saying plant-based beef, but rather saying like plant-based, I don't know, soy lettuce. Yeah, right, plant-based nuggets or something, or soy patties, which is less appealing. So yeah, they're trying quite hard.
Okay, so right up here, a couple behind.
Hi, thank you. I came a few minutes after your presentation started, so I'm not sure whether you mentioned whether you are working with, in collaboration with other organizations. I did hear that you're pretty new, so I'm really excited to see like the results of your studies. but like there are organizations and campaigns set in place. For example, the plant-based treaty that actually was initiated here in Toronto. And for example, we go to universities or like city mayors. For example, the New York City mayor endorsed the plant-based treaty, where institutions set like reducing their carbon footprint for like, I don't know, 2050 or 2030, and encouraging them to adhere to a more plant-based focus in their in lunch menus or whatever, encouraging them that, you know, if they switch, they will reduce their carbon footprint faster. So I was just curious, like, did the studies that are coming are just based on your university for now, or are you planning to, like, how large are your studies going to become?
Yeah, so currently, we're working just with universities in terms of where we do the studies. We do have a number of nonprofit partners who have been super great intellectual partners. So Rethink Priorities, Phonalytics, Sentience Institute, Climate Refarm. So they've been awesome. And we also have done a couple of what we call like mind melds, where we get together, myself and the leadership of other sort of evidence-based nonprofits, and just try to think about our joint priorities, learn from each other, and, you know, try to understand where we can help them or they can help us, and stuff like that. So we haven't expanded beyond universities, but that's very much in the works when we have an intervention that we feel like is worth doing that in terms of effectiveness.
Okay, I think we have one more. We have two more. If we can squeeze these two in.
Thank you for the presentation. I had a question about government food guides. So in 2019, the Canadian government changed the Canada Food Guide to have increased emphasis on plant-based foods. I was curious whether you think those types of policy changes have an effect and are effective.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not sure. I mean, the tricky thing with dietary guidelines is people have been eating in ways that don't follow the dietary guidelines for a long time. So I'm not that convinced that individuals are choosing their foods based on the food pyramid or equivalence. I do think it might send a useful overall social message of, you know, it kind of takes some of the teeth out of health concerns around where am I getting at protein, where am I getting at B12, like all these things. If it's actually, you know, as it is, an evidence-based finding that's disseminated by the government that plant-based diets are healthy and safe. So I do think it could serve that purpose. Yeah, I'm not that convinced that dietary guidelines alone, unfortunately, shift people significantly.
Right over here. And was that the last person?
Hi, thanks for all this. Just following up kind of on the fact that the industry uses some of these techniques like sort of against us. I'm wondering if you can sort of clarify whether there are any differences between, you know, what the dairy industry, for example, does with their advertising at point of purchase versus like what these, like what we're calling nudges is doing. Like, are we playing catch up with what the industry has been doing, or is there some distinction that's relevant?
Yeah, this is really important, and I've actually spoken with a number of folks in industry as well who are kind of mission aligned to basically ask, like, we don't want to do stuff that's just redundant with market research. That's not the point. It's not just to get papers out. And yeah, so the feedback I got from him and others was really, no, it's really not redundant, because again, the companies are really trying to compete, you know, not only with meat, but also with other companies, and they're studying their things in, you know, relatively circumscribed settings and not making their results public for understandable reasons. So his take was like, absolutely, you know, you should go forward with this type of research. And because also I do think the goals are kind of complementary, right? And that we want to nudge people towards all the plant-based company products, as well as like tofu, which has never had a great spokesperson or, you know, or anything like that. So yeah, you know, moving people just towards any plant-based option rather than a specific product. But I do think there's complementarity, certainly, and we're excited for all the plant-based companies. We're rooting for them all.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much, Maya. And please, any other questions? Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.